Have you ever noticed something strange? People seem to notice you more than you expect, but nothing ever actually happens. They look, they stay aware, and then they walk away without saying a word. No approach, no conversation, nothing. And that gap between being noticed and being approached is where things start to feel confusing. Because attention is clearly there, but action never follows. And once you start noticing this pattern, it becomes hard to ignore, because it keeps repeating in the same quiet way every time. At first it feels random, like coincidence, like something you are overthinking. But the more it happens, the more consistent it feels, and eventually it starts to feel like a pattern that you cannot explain. And that is where most people get it wrong, because they assume that if nothing is happening, then nothing is there. But in reality, a lot is happening. It is just happening internally, silently, and never crossing into action. It usually does not come from a lack of interest. It comes from hesitation. The moment someone feels drawn to you, their mind does not move forward. It pauses. It starts to evaluate everything at once: the timing, the situation, how it might look, and what could go wrong. And that pause, even if it lasts only a few seconds, is enough to interrupt the natural flow of action. Because attraction is immediate, but action requires decision. And decision requires certainty. And certainty is something most people do not have in social moments. So instead of moving forward, they stay where they are. They observe a little longer, thinking that maybe there will be a better moment, a clearer signal, something that makes it feel easier to act. But that moment rarely arrives, because the longer they wait, the more complicated it becomes. And as they wait, something else begins to take over. Because the mind does not like uncertainty. It tries to fill in the gaps with imagined outcomes. It starts creating small scenarios: how the interaction might go, what they would say, how you might respond, whether it would feel natural or awkward, whether it would go well or fall apart. And the more they think, the more detailed those scenarios become. What started as a simple feeling turns into a mental simulation with too many possibilities. And when there are too many possibilities, the brain does something predictable. It avoids risk. Even if the outcome could be positive, uncertainty feels uncomfortable, and discomfort is enough to stop action. So doing nothing begins to feel like the safer option. And from the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. But inside, a decision has already been made. Then something even more subtle begins to shape the situation. Perception. Because people do not respond to reality directly, they respond to how they interpret it. And that interpretation happens instantly. The way you carry yourself, the way you exist in a space, your stillness, your focus, your energy, all of it forms an impression before a single word is spoken. And sometimes that impression creates distance. Not because it is negative, but because it feels complete on its own. If someone perceives you as calm, confident, or slightly distant, they may assume you do not need interaction, or that approaching you would feel unnecessary or even intrusive. And instead of testing that assumption, they accept it. They treat it as reality. So they stay back. They watch, but they do not move forward. And over time, that creates a strange dynamic where you are visible but not reachable, present but not approached. And that can feel confusing because from your perspective, nothing is being expressed. But from their perspective, something has already been decided. Then there is fear. Not just fear of rejection, but fear of uncertainty itself. Because approaching someone means stepping into something unpredictable. Unpredictability is something the mind tries to avoid. It prefers control. It prefers knowing what will happen next. And when that certainty is missing, even a small action can feel like a risk. So even when the feeling is there, it gets overridden by the need to stay in control. And control often means doing nothing. Timing also plays a bigger role than most people realize. Someone can feel drawn to you in a specific moment, but still not act on it because something feels slightly off. Maybe the environment does not feel right. Maybe they are distracted or not fully present. Maybe they think they will have another chance later. But later rarely works the same way as the original moment. Because that initial moment is built on instinct, and once it passes, it gets replaced by thought. And thought slows everything down. So the opportunity disappears without ever becoming visible. And when this happens repeatedly, it starts to form a pattern. Attention without action. Awareness without interaction. And over time, that pattern becomes familiar. The brain adapts to it. It becomes easier to observe than to act, easier to stay silent than to take a step forward. And this is where most people get stuck without realizing it. Because from the outside, it looks like nothing is happening at all. But underneath, there are layers of hesitation. Overthinking, perception, fear, and timing, all working together to prevent something simple from ever starting. And the longer this continues, the more natural it feels for nothing to happen. Because once a moment passes without action, it becomes harder to return to it. It fades into the background, becoming just another missed opportunity that no one acknowledges. And eventually, both sides move on, never knowing that there was something there in the first place. And this is why being noticed and being approached are completely different experiences. One requires nothing. The other requires overcoming multiple invisible barriers at once. And most people never do that in a single moment. So what you end up seeing is not a lack of interest, but a lack of action. Not absence, but hesitation. Not rejection, but avoidance of uncertainty. And once you understand that, the entire situation starts to make more sense. Because it stops feeling personal and starts to feel predictable. It is not that something is missing. It is that something never crossed the line from thought into action. And that space in between where everything is felt, but nothing is done. It's where most human interactions quietly disappear before they ever begin. And the more aware you become of that space, the more you start to see how often it happens, not just around you, but everywhere. In small moments, in passing interactions, in situations where something could have happened, but did not. And once you see it clearly, it changes how you interpret those moments. Because you realize that silence does not always mean absence, and distance does not always mean disinterest. Sometimes it simply means that hesitation was stronger than action. And that is something most people never overcome in the moment when it matters. And when you understand that deeply, something shifts in how you see people. Because you begin to recognize that most behavior is not about what is visible on the surface, but about what is happening underneath it. In the space where thoughts interrupt actions and where feelings never get expressed. And once you see that, the pattern stops feeling confusing. And starts to feel like something you can predict, because it is not random, it is structured. It follows the same invisible steps again and again: hesitation, overthinking, perception, fear, delay, and then silence. And that silence is not empty. It is full of things that never happened.